All right. Is everyone ready? Did you dry your eyes after the keynote? I got some feedback that we need to put little boxes of Kleenex on the table. Oh, you brought your own Kleenex. That guy's been here before. You were here last year, weren't you? I know. The people at my table are like, Doug, well, why did you do this at the beginning? But what a profound discussion. And it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Gardner from Thorn. And we're going to have a similarly provocative discussion on technology and how we're going to eradicate evil from the planet. So, Sarah, would you mind starting just with an overview of what you do at Thorn and why you're here?
Absolutely. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. And I feel like I'm among comrades. I was saying to someone earlier, I was actually nervous about talking to this group because we're peers, right? We all work in this space in one way or another. So I care much more about what we think as a group about the work that we're doing as opposed to pitching some Wall Street guy on Thorn or whatever. So anyway, I'm really honored to be with you all today. So Thorn is a nonprofit, started about 5 years ago, and we have a very, very narrow focus on the intersection of technology and child sexual exploitation. And something we think about a lot is that, or say a lot, is that technology has democratized child sexual abuse. So it has essentially created an environment where perpetrators can now hide behind advanced technologies, anonymizing technologies, and the internet to exploit children. And we sort of arrived at this work in an interesting way, which was our founder, Ashton Kutcher, and Demi Moore, who are our co-founders, had watched a documentary about child sex trafficking in Cambodia and had a moment where they say, you can't unknow something. It's like once you see what's happening in the world and the horror of sex trafficking, it sort of stayed with them, and they were like, this is an issue we want to commit to forever. But also, like people who are new to an issue, they learn very quickly it's complex. It has a lot of moving parts. It doesn't look the same in different countries. And sure enough, it's happening right here in the United States. And so they wanted to really be additive to the space. They didn't want to just reinvent the wheel and start another organization that was doing something that another nonprofit was already doing and doing well. So instead, they took a break. They said, let's take a year and a half and actually learn what's happening and all the work that's going on around sex trafficking. And through that process, they, along with our current CEO, talked to over 100 nonprofit organizations. They talked to law enforcement, and they talked to private industry, to companies. And the question was, around this issue of child sexual exploitation, what are you seeing? And where do you see a gap? And what was really interesting was the sort of resounding message was technology is kind of entered into this space and is being used to abuse kids, and the response in terms of the technical response is about 10 to 15 years behind. So everywhere from law enforcement officers who are trying to find child sex trafficking victims in the United States using a notebook, writing notes down from all of these online escort ads, trying to track kids and where they've moved across certain states, to nonprofit organizations having ideas about if we only had an app that could connect victims to safe homes to go to when they come out of the life, et cetera. And it wasn't just like, oh, technology could be useful, but it was who is going to actually build the technology. So that was where there was clearly a gap. Because, and many of you probably have seen instances of this in your own work, a lot of times there are wonderful ideas around technology, or there's a hackathon where a great prototype is produced of something that could be a real solution to something. But the question of who will actually continue to build that product, who will maintain that tool, who will continue to add features in and make it respond to some change in the marketplace or the system, that was still a question mark. So we really decided to narrowly focus on that technical piece. And we started by doing research and understanding where there were instances where technology could be interjected or injected for change. And then we met with groups of engineers from a lot of the major companies, and we sat in a room and said, here are the challenges that people are facing around these issues. What do you think? And engineers have an entirely different way of looking at problems, and it's one that does not necessarily marry initially with sort of the mentality of how do you create the most change quickly necessarily, or so you have to kind of balance their response of very logically kind of tackling a problem and thinking about how technology could be interjected, and then balance that with the human aspect of what that would actually mean for someone using the tool out in the field looking for children. So that's where we decided to focus, and I can tell you a little bit later about how we've sort of morphed into kind of a tech company in that regard. But that was the process by which we decided to sort of laser in on technology.
Okay, well, so we were talking about how Amazon Web Services and Thorn got connected.
Yeah.
And I remember, and Marco may remember this as well, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, we got an email forwarded down to us from Jeff Bezos, and it was from Ashton Kutcher. And we looked at it for a little while, and I think we said, is this for real? Because Ashton isn't the first person you think about with a nonprofit and with technology.
Yeah.
And so the two of them together, we did a little research, realized that it wasn't a practical joke, and did the follow-up.
I'm so glad.
I know. So how did Ashton, though, we know him as a comedian and a TV personality.
Yeah.
How did he, you mentioned a little bit about the cause, but how did he, I look at Thorn as a technology innovative startup.
Yeah.
Where did the technology come in from, the technology aspect?
That's a great question. And this is true of Ashton, but it's, I think, true of technologists in general, which is when technologists create something, they think of it like this is their baby, right? This is the new product they've built, the new company. And there's a lot of weight that comes with that responsibility, and they also care what happens to it, we find. So if you create something like a platform with live streaming content, for instance, and now people can connect and do all these wonderful things, and then the flip side of that is perpetrators are flocking to live streaming because if they abuse a kid over a live streaming platform, then there's no record of it. I would say 9 times out of 10, and I'm looking at my colleague Sarah because she's also here in the room, 9 times out of 10 when you have a conversation with that founder of, hey, did you know this is happening on your platform, that there's this instance of this other way it's being used, they respond with, I want to help, that's not what this was intended for, what are we going to do about it? And I think giving some of the responsibility back to them is important because they understand it best, they understand what it was intended for, and they also don't want it to be used by bad people. And so when you ask about Ashton, I think as he was becoming an investor in technologies in general, one of the questions he was also asking himself was, what are going to be the side effects of these investments? And also, what responsibility does the private sector have in addressing these problems? And also an opportunity for them to own part of the response. I always find that people are much more engaged in a problem donor, foundation, the engineers that we work with, if you ask them, how would you solve this? Like, get their actual buy-in into it instead of just telling them what you want to do. So it kind of puts the onus back on them too. Like, you need to help us come up with this solution. And so the AWS relationship has been so huge for us because a large part of our work is how do we store all this stuff that we're collecting in the cloud? But also, we encountered a partner in you all who immediately understood what we were trying to do and came to the table and said, yes, this is something we want to support you guys on. This is how we could do it. It's very clear what we needed, and you had it, and there was no hesitation. You guys were right there. So it was clearly a good ask to make. And I think it goes back to what Dan was saying yesterday, that he said a lot of things that resonated with me, but one of them was, you have to make the ask. And this is true of technology companies and technologists themselves. You have to say to them, we need your help in fixing this problem.
So I heard you and Amy talking before we started, and you were very technical. I mean, you were having a very technical discussion. Do you both come from a technical background?
No, absolutely not. And the joke amongst like our engineering team is at hackathons, I'm like smiling on my computer and they're like, see, Sarah's not hacking. You never smile like when you're hacking. So clearly I like give it away that I'm a non-technical person at technical events. So I was not a technical person. Our current CEO came out of the private sector, worked at Motorola, so she had some more bearings, if you will. But that's an important thing to bring up, is sort of this shift that happened. Originally, we thought we'd be kind of like an incubator. So we'd get these engineers together in a room and we'd come up with some interesting idea on a tool to fight online child sex trafficking, for instance. It was a Google engineer who had the original idea for our current tool, Spotlight, which is our child sex trafficking investigations tool. So sort of the first 2-3 years was kind of gathering that group together, and then we'd have these really interesting ideas or proof of concepts, and sometimes we would go to an outside engineer and say, can you just can you put this together for us? What would this look like? And then we'd get this proof of concept that would actually work. And then the original idea was, great, so once we think something works, we'll give it to a catcher. So a catcher was someone or something we described as law enforcement or private industry or other nonprofits. So once we have a beta of a sex trafficking tool that works, we'll give it to law enforcement and say, here, take it, now you use it. And what we realized is there are no catchers in this space, because law enforcement said back to us, we don't want you to give it to us. If you give us the technology and we own it, it will come here to die.
In fact, you had the opposite scenario where security would come to you with a particular case in certain situations.
Yes, yeah. So they were saying, if you give us the tech, it will die. If you keep the tech and you keep innovating on it, it will live and it will flourish and it will continue to be useful for us. And that was a huge shift for our organization, was realizing we were not going to just be able to incubate, but instead we had to hold on to the tool for a long period of time. I think the instance you're referring to, that shift coincided with a case that I can honestly tell you was sort of the turning point in our organization of realizing that we were going to make that commitment to building technical tools. So I shared this with you last night, but about 3 years ago, we were called by a law enforcement agency in the United States about a case of child sexual abuse material they were investigating. And I'm going to change the name, so we'll call it the Katie case. And they had heard that we had been doing innovative work in this space. We had built a child sex trafficking tool at that point. We were also doing some work on online behavior change and deterring people from looking for and searching for child abuse content. But the environment in which these officers were investigating was the dark web. And they told us that this case came to them from Europe. A hard drive had been seized, and the images of this little girl being horrifically abused were on that hard drive. It was the first time anybody had seen the images. The person arrested was not the offender. He had collected these images from somewhere. And they came to us and showed us sanitized images of this case and said, you know, we are literally at our wit's end. We cannot find this child. Not only do we know this abuse has gone on for 2 years, we're in the dark web now and we're seeing that it's still continuing. So they were going into their office every day, pulling up their computer and seeing new images of this girl being abused. So it was still happening. And their ask of us at the time was, do you have any dark web technology that could help with this? And or could you take this child's face and go make a case for running child facial recognition at any sort of large company that does social media, because maybe this kid's face is on the internet in other places and we can make the identification that way. So we tried that. We went and we made the ask of a few big companies, and to their credit, they did not say no. The challenge was we had no parameters. Like we couldn't run it against all of the photos in America. It would break the system. They didn't have the computing power. So the questions were like, could you narrow it to a region? Could you? And those were all the things that we couldn't do. And we also didn't work in the dark web at that point.
So what year was this again?
This was 2014. So that girl went on to be abused for another year and a half. And Ashton actually, I remember, said, can I tweet her face out? Because maybe like we'll find her in 5 minutes. And they said no, because it's too much of a risk to the child. So obviously law enforcement are the heroes of this situation because they were looking at the content. But we had that girl's image in our heads for like another year. There is no reason that that child should have A, been in that situation at all, but B, that her content was out for those to see on the dark web for 2 years before law enforcement even found it. And then another year and a half went by before she was rescued. And the reason we hadn't gone into the dark web was we were scared. It's a tough technical challenge. It's an anonymized version of the internet. We only had one engineer at the time, and we knew that it was going to be really, really hard. And that was the moment where we realized, like, if it's hard and no one's going to do it for commercial reasons, there's no money to be made, who's going to do it? So we decided to take that on. And that was the shift to, we've got to hire a lot more engineers. The technical skill of the organization is going to have to go way, way up. And I'm happy to say that we've done that, and the tool that we've built has now rescued 114 kids. 114,
including the young lady?
Well, no, she was rescued the traditional investigative way. But since then...
But just to finish that story.
Yeah. She is rescued. Okay. Her abuser is in prison for 135 years, all right. Which is awesome. Yeah. So...
and then 114. So that was that first case that you called the KD case, I think, was the one where you realized that law enforcement didn't have the technology, that you yourselves didn't really have the technology yet to be effective.
Right.
And then you modernized. Can you tell me a little bit, because this is what Dan Pallotta was talking about yesterday, and I think many of the nonprofits who are here are in the situation where they realize they're being judged differently than other organizations. If a standard organization, a for-profit, says that they're going to modernize their infrastructure, or they're going to invest in technology or hire a bunch of developers and analysts, that's looked at as favorable. When a nonprofit realizes that you couldn't accomplish your mission because you didn't have the technology, and then I think you have like 22 employees, over half of whom now are technologists, they're engineers.
Products,
they're product developers.
Yeah.
And that's a major shift for a nonprofit.
Yeah.
How did you have that discussion? First with, Ashton and your other investors, telling them, so it sounds like Ashton had a predisposition toward technology. He was doing technology investment, passionate about the mission, and then had to have this realization that if law enforcement was bringing cases to you that they couldn't solve, and
it's
then
terrifying.
You lacked the technology, something had to be done. So can you share with us the discussion about how you brought technology into the mission of your organization?
Yeah, I think we're unique for the reasons that you described, in that we're actually trying to build technical tools for some of the greatest challenges that are out there technically right now. And that's not true of a lot of nonprofit work. It's important for us to recognize where the human component is, right, and where the technical component is. So we are trying to solve that technical problem. So that's why we do need half of our staff are engineers. I think one of the things that's really important to think about is where you want to inject technology for what purpose, and really understanding if it will be useful there. So like the worst thing you can do is just be like, well, we should just start to use technology because everybody wants us to. Like, what should we do? How, like, where can we just stick it in? That typically, and we've gone through that, it does not work. So understanding where there is real need for technology is the first stage. And then from there.
And so you had that. So we learned in the St.
Case.
Jude presentation next door that you have to have your story down.
100%.
So you got your story down with you need technology in order to accomplish your mission, and you were very crisply able to articulate, here's where we need it, and we need to, and they're costly. Engineers are costly.
Yeah.
So tell me about the discussions you had with your investors,
but
please.
that was interesting because I felt like people were eager to do it. So with our trafficking investigations tool, for instance, we showed a proof of concept to a donor. It wasn't even a full tool yet, and she was like, yep, I want to invest in that. I want it up and running in 6 months, and I want to use it for the Super Bowl because I'm worried there's going to be trafficking in our city for that particular Super Bowl. So it almost felt like we were being pushed by our funders to go even commit even more and move faster, as opposed to, I think looking back, we probably could have moved faster. We probably could have brought in engineers even sooner. But we were a little bit in that mindset of we're a nonprofit. So first we were like, well, can we outsource people? Can Google lend us somebody? Can Microsoft lend us somebody? You know, you are immediately like, this is going to get very costly very quickly. And we were in the unique position where our funders, they were like ready for that. I mean, that's what I was saying about Dan saying, make the ask. Like, I've never said to a funder, maybe this is because they also just, they aren't interested in this. So I'm talking to a lot of people who are interested in technology, but I've never said to a funder, we're gonna pay this engineer like almost market value to do this work because it's really important and we've gotta get the best engineer. And they've been like, no, we should definitely pay less and get a less good engineer. Like, no one has ever said that to
So
me.
how did you make the decision, though, to do the hiring versus, like you said, you talked to some other technology
Here's why that didn't
companies?
work. So
Oh, you tried it?
The lending people,
Okay.
yeah. So lending people is great if you have engineers on your team ready to receive the influx of energy from the outside engineers and can actually take that, what their work is, you know, take their work and action on it. So this is where like the idea of hackathons and everything get challenging, because people will be like, let's do a hackathon on this problem, and then they build something, and then what happens? Who's going to keep working on that forever, right? And so the challenge with the lending model is if you don't have a core team that will keep that work going, then it will always, as much as the lended engineer talent wants to help you, it is their second job.
They're going to get pulled back.
Yep,
Eventually they get pulled back.
it's their second job.
So how do you decide, so how large is the team? And how did you decide the specific number of engineers to have?
Well, that is an ongoing process.
Okay. Okay, that's good though. I'm
so-
sure everyone is asking themselves. I hear Sarah laughing.
Yeah, well, it's,
Probably had a debate about that. in the
yeah.
lobby.
I mean, we're learning things we had no idea about. I think one of the biggest realizations for me is product, like product in general, building product is fascinating, and it is so complicated. And I very naively thought that I maybe was like, oh yeah, a sex trafficking tool, could it do this and this, and it could do this, that'd be so cool. But when you bring in someone who actually knows how to build a tool, your mind is blown in terms of like what they think about.
Exceeding expectations?
Yes,
or-
and also just more like it's an art that is so beyond anything that any of us knew how to do who weren't technical. So the way you think about how the tool will be used, how your users will respond, how to elevate certain features, like what's the order that you're gonna put the features in. I mean, it's an art form.
So can you share one of the discussions? So you brought engineers in,
Yeah.
and you had one or two to start.
Yeah.
And you went through these brainstorming ideas and realized that you could even increase the scope of your mission.
Yeah.
Can you share one of those discussions?
So the products that we've built so far have kind of come to us, the sex trafficking investigations tool and the dark web tool that we're working on now. But I think now we have the confidence and we have the talent to look out in the future and say, instead of waiting for it to come to us, like we're thinking about, and I'm sure a lot of the issues that you guys work on too might interact with this, like blockchain and crypto. Like, what is that going to mean for bad behavior? It's going to be not great because we've taken the financial element out of buying child abuse content. So Ernie Allen, who's on our board, former NCMEC CEO for 25 years, talks about how the trade of child pornography basically died in the late 90s because the US Postal Service got really, really good at intervening in cases. And this is back when people were physically mailing abuse content to each other. So the barrier of entry for participation was like, can you imagine, like, how do you start that conversation with someone? Like, I'm going to send you some stuff, and I mean, it's insane. So it was a very small group of people participating in it, and then the internet blew that up, right? And then all of a sudden, it was everywhere. It was on the open web. It remains on the open web. It's very easy to find it. And then the financial element was stripped away when all the credit card companies came together and said, you should not be able to buy child abuse content with a Visa. Great, totally agree. So they closed all that down, right? So now the financial component of the production of that abuse content was stripped away, and the content itself kind of became the currency. So trading is that's the currency in those environments. With the introduction of crypto, we might see the financial element reinserted, and then you wonder, what's that going to mean in terms of people being, inspired to then abuse or jump into that market or make money. So the difference now, I guess, is we were reactive a little bit before. Like, we heard they needed a sex trafficking tool. We heard they needed a dark web tool. And now we're like, let's start to think about blockchain and crypto now instead of waiting a few more years when it gets really, really bad.
So that's what you're focused on now. Are there any other things that you're focused on in the near or?
Live streaming is also a challenge. So the model before was, if you had a collection of content that was abuse material, the way those cases are even prosecuted in the United States is how much content you have dictates your sentence. It's very outdated in terms of how we conceptualize and think about people who have this kind of content. Because now, if it's a live streaming platform, you can just go on a live streaming platform and abuse a child in real time on video, and then you can sign off and there's no record of it. So it's no longer that model of like finding content as a way to find the bad guy is no longer gonna work. And so we're gonna have to think about other things, and we're gonna have to engage live streaming platforms, et cetera, in the response.
So I am going to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you can think of some questions that you have for Sarah or Amy, I'm going to put you on the spot too. So we have a couple representatives from Thorn here. I do have one or two more questions for you. So knowing what you know now, what do you wish you knew a year ago or 2 years ago at Thorn that you would have done faster, sooner? Or, and I think the reason why I'm asking this question is, many nonprofits who are here want to inject technology into their mission. Mm-hmm. What recommendations do you have for, you talked about just having, we heard today on main stage, have a story. Yeah. Understand why you're doing it. What other advice do you have for the nonprofits?
First,
Sorry, I asked you a bunch of questions.
No, it's good. But I think the thing I regret is I was hesitant on hiring as many engineers as quickly as we did because it was so expensive. And now that I think about that, that was a Dan mind block, right?
Yeah, you're going to be punished for it.
That was something I wish I had gotten on board with faster.
So what was the cadence? You hired one or two?
Yeah.
And then waited a couple years? And how many
I mean,
are you at now?
well, actually, they won because they kept saying we need more of them, and I lost.
This is the
But
investor,
I just
the
wish I
investors.
had been the engineering team.
The
They were
engineering
like,
team was
yes,
saying, we need more help.
yes,
We need more help if
yes.
we're going to build these products.
Yeah, and I'm over here thinking like, this is a real budget. This is becoming a real budget. And now now seeing what they can do as quickly as they can do it with the amount of people that they have, I wish that just personally I had been more supportive of that earlier. So that's like that's my regret about that.
Okay.
Again, I didn't win, so it's fine. They're there now. But I just wish I had like pushed myself to be more forward thinking on that front. But advice-wise, so, because again, I think I'm all for, I think injecting technology into things is really important, but I also think it shouldn't be forced. And there is a conversation to be had. So yes, having technical funders who are willing to put up that money for that first engineer are huge. But it's a conversation then about expectations on timing, on risk, on all those things, with actually sort of more traditional philanthropists who have been working on issues for a long time. So I agree that we need to move faster with technology, and all of that is great. But I also think part of my job is to educate my funders who are very technical and want to move like this, that these are real issues that will not just go away in a year's time. That's a dialogue, because just to say that if we all lean further into tech, it's gonna all get better, I actually don't think is fair or true. So I find that what is really great is pairing a technical funder with a non-technical funder and seeing them talk. Because they kind of learn from each other. Like, they meet someone who's been funding in the, well, the example was, honestly, Ashton met Bill Gates, and Bill Gates said, I've been spending millions and millions of dollars eradicating polio all over the world. We basically thought we had it, completely gone, and then we went into Boko Haram's camp a year ago, 2 years ago, and there were like 30 new cases, and now we've got to raise another, it was a lot of money, like $1 billion, to fully eradicate it again, even just from those 30 cases popping back up. Like, just hearing that it will continue on potentially isn't a bad thing for the technical mind to hear. So that's sort of that dialogue that happens that I think is really important. And in terms of advice, I would say, so look at your work and think about where you really do see tech playing a critical role. Define that problem, come in with stories, but also come in with data, because technical people, they need the case made not just with the story, but also with the actual data. Mm-hmm. So you can say, like, we're doing this many cases, it takes us 5 hours to do them, I have to input data that's this amount of my time. We would increase efficiencies by 30% if this amount of my work could be reduced to an hour. And then I would be able to help X amount of more people. What do you think? Like, is there something there? Could we build something like to do that? And then give it to them and see what they do with it. And it can be like 2 engineers. It doesn't have to be a huge, massive group of like really important technical people. It can just get like a few together and get them brainstorming. And then from there, they'll say like, well, we could try this or we could try that. And then you're sort of like, that's interesting. I wish we had an engineer. At which point they say like, well, maybe I could lend my talent at first and do this for you for free. And then once you get into it, you can kind of go back to your funders and say like, look what we have this whole plan for. We want to build it. We've got to hire 2 people to do it. I mean, that's kind of the model that we've used.
So bring data, challenge the engineers, let them brainstorm. And it doesn't need to be a huge army. How many employees does Thorn have?
No. 21 now.
21? How many engineers?
We have 3 headcount open.
3 headcount open, if anyone's interested in
hiring.
applying. Well, so I could keep asking you questions. I'd love to hear from the audience. Does anyone have a question for Sarah that you've been thinking of? I can keep going. You look like you're thinking about it. No? Okay. Any questions? So I'll ask another then, Sarah. What are the advantages of being a nonprofit building a tech startup? Like, are there advantages to being a nonprofit and going technical?
Yes. The impact side is so easy to measure. So we have the data in the tools that show us how often people are using it. The cases I told you about, actually that is a bit hit or miss because law enforcement doesn't always report back to us, so we feel like we get a little bit of an under-reporting there. But we can see, like we can say we spent X amount of time in this environment and we've collected like 5 million messages of, so it's very tangible in that way. And that is something that makes that is just easier with technology, whereas if you're trying to capture, you know, a human rights education program in a rural community somewhere and you're trying to show a change in attitude towards sending kids to school, like it's so much harder to capture that and measure that, but that is equally as important. So that part of it, showing the impact, is really the technical side of our work aids making the case for that.
And 114 successful
and
resolutions.
And that's just the dark web tool. The sex trafficking investigations tool has been used in 18,000 cases here in the U.S. So that's great. It's really powerful, and in that sense, technology is a big advantage.
So Polaris, NCMEC,
ICMEC's
law
here.
enforcement.
Yep.
How do you work with? It seems you all have a similar or a part of the mission. How do you collaborate with these organizations?
That's a really great question. And I don't know if Nancy's here from Polaris. Yay, there's Nancy, and Mara from ICMEC. Awesome. So these guys have really big jobs because they are like the centers for which all the incoming information about missing and exploited children or sex trafficking victims in the United States or internationally are flowing into their organizations, and they're having to prioritize what kids to look for, where, how are they going to get all that information out to the appropriate law enforcement entity who can go look for that child. Or in Polaris's case, you know, how someone's reaching out for help, they're ready to leave the life. How do you engage that person in a safe and meaningful way to be there for them when they really are ready to leave, and make sure that you capture, you know, that moment and help them through that process. So they are fielding like a ton of incoming information and data, and
so they bring cases to you along with...
so they're just receiving it.
They're receiving.
And so what we kind of said to these guys at the beginning was like, let us go out and take the risk to incubate the new idea for the technology that could potentially help either reduce those cases over time or go in the hands of law enforcement so they're more efficient, so that you guys can keep doing what you're doing. Because to ask either organization to take on that risk when you are so actively engaged with the victims in real time is a hard risk to take on. So the way we kind of positioned it was like, let us incubate for you and come up with these tools, and we will take the risk and the cost of hiring the engineers to build it so that the whole system can flourish better. Is how I see it, but it is a very collaborative partnership, and there's no like silver bullet. There's not one organization that's going to be able to solve child sexual exploitation.
Yeah, but the ecosystem works together.
Yeah.
Good. We have 2 more minutes. Is anyone brave enough to ask a question? Sure.
How much of your work is international versus the domestic in the U.S.?
Great question. So the sex trafficking investigations tool is focused in the U.S., and then the dark web tool is international. So we have law enforcement in 28 different countries using it, but that's because it's international in nature, right? So if you're on the dark web, nobody knows where you are, so they all have to like collaborate together. The other instance is, you know, I'm an officer in Seattle trying to find child sex trafficking victims, so I really just need to like zero in on my own jurisdiction. Although it does have the deconfliction element of it, where if that kid then goes to a different city, they can ping somebody there and say, hey, I think this kid's moving your direction. You might want to try and meet up with them as well. But it brings up a really good point, which is the sort of work on the child abuse imagery side of things. Like, if we build the right thing, like if we're able to succeed, then all the other countries don't have to build it too, which is a huge scale advantage. And maybe it's not even us building it, it's like empowering Interpol with new tools so they can house information that can be easily shared, et cetera. So that is an element of technology also, I guess, when you were saying, like, what are some of the advantages? It's an internet-driven crime and situation, so the internet looks the same. And that's an advantage, whereas that sex trafficking tool, you cannot go just replicate that in a totally different country where all the circumstances are different and expect it to work. You would have to reorganize it and reshape it to work for that area. It's a really good question.
Thank you for the question. We are at time. Sarah, first of all, thank you for working for Thorn and doing your mission. And second, thank you for being here and sharing with us on the stage. And Sarah will be here if you have any questions, and we now have a 15-minute break. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.